I never expected my retirement project to turn into a legal battlefield. But when I bought the 1920s Craftsman bungalow on Magnolia Street in Pasadena, California, I thought I was finally getting my dream home. The place had good bones, original hardwood floors, and a yard big enough for the vegetable garden I'd been planning for years. What I didn't know was that this house came with a secret weapon against the tyrannical Homeowners Association that had been terrorizing the neighborhood for the past decade. My name is Yannick Thornton, and I'm a 52-year-old contractor who spent 30 years building other people's dreams before deciding to create my own. The house was a steal at $700,000, which in Southern California meant it needed work. But I had the skills, the time, and the enthusiasm to transform it into something special. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson, had passed away, and her children were eager to sell quickly. The inspection revealed some outdated plumbing and electrical work, but nothing I couldn't handle myself. I moved in on a sunny Saturday in March, and by Monday morning, I had my first visitor. She arrived at exactly 8 o'clock, rapping on my front door with the kind of authority usually reserved for law enforcement. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with a woman in her late 40s, blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, wearing a pantsuit that screamed, "I want to speak to your manager." "Good morning," she said, though her tone suggested it was anything but. "I'm Brenda Patterson, president of the Magnolia Gardens Homeowners Association. I'm here to welcome you to the neighborhood and go over some important rules." I wiped my hands on my jeans and smiled. "Nice to meet you, Brenda. I'm Yannick. Come on in, though I should warn you, I'm still unpacking." She stepped inside without waiting for further invitation, her eyes scanning my living room like a health inspector at a failing restaurant. She pulled out a thick binder from her oversized purse and dropped it on my coffee table with a thud. "This is your HOA handbook," she announced. "It contains all the guidelines you'll need to follow. I've flagged several sections that require immediate attention." I picked up the binder, flipping through pages of regulations. No fences over 4 feet tall. No vegetable gardens visible from the street. All exterior paint colors must be approved by the board. No parking commercial vehicles in driveways. The list went on and on. "This is pretty extensive," I said carefully. "We maintain high standards in Magnolia Gardens," Brenda replied, emphasizing each word. "Your property is currently in violation of several codes. The lawn needs to be cut to exactly 2.5 inches. Those bushes," she gestured toward my front window, "are 6 inches too tall. And that mailbox is the wrong shade of black." I glanced at the mailbox through the window. It looked black to me. "The wrong shade. Approved mailbox black is specified as Sherwin-Williams tricorn black. Yours appears to be iron ore. You'll need to repaint it within 14 days or face a $50 fine." Something in my chest tightened. I'd dealt with building inspectors, county officials, and demanding clients for 3 decades, but something about Brenda's attitude rubbed me the wrong way. "I just moved in 2 days ago. The rules apply to all residents regardless of move-in date," she said flatly. "I'll also need to inspect your backyard before you leave." "My backyard? We've had reports of unpermitted structures. I need to ensure everything is in compliance." I hadn't even been in the backyard except to unlock the gate. "Be my guest." We walked through my house, Brenda making little disapproving noises at the boxes stacked in the hallway. The backyard was overgrown but charming, with a brick patio, several mature fruit trees, and an old greenhouse that needed some repairs. Brenda's face turned red when she saw the greenhouse. "That structure is not on the approved building list. It will need to come down." What? That greenhouse has been here for decades. If it's not on the approved list, it's unpermitted. You have 30 days to remove it or hire a contractor to do so. She made a note on her tablet. I'm also citing you for the overgrown vegetation. Grass cannot exceed 3 inches anywhere on the property. Again, I just moved in. I'm making a note of that, but the violations stand. You should also know that we've had complaints about your truck. She pointed at my work truck parked in the driveway, a white F-250 with my company name on the side. Commercial vehicles are not permitted in driveways between the hours of 6 p.m. and 8 a.m. Where am I supposed to park it? That's not the HOA's concern. You'll need to find alternative parking. She snapped her binder shut. I'll be sending you a formal violation notice within 48 hours. Good day, Mr. Thornton. She left, and I stood in my backyard, staring at the greenhouse and feeling my blood pressure rise. I'd bought this house to escape stress, not dive headfirst into more of it. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 4 more violation notices. The grass was apparently still too long despite my cutting it. The paint on my front door was deemed too weathered and needed refreshing. I had left a ladder visible from the street, which violated the no visible tools or equipment rule. Each violation came with a $50 fine and a deadline. I tried to comply where I could. I repainted the mailbox, though I couldn't tell the difference between the 2 shades of black. I moved my truck to a storage facility 3 miles away, adding 20 minutes to my morning routine. But the greenhouse issue gnawed at me. I didn't want to tear it down. It was a beautiful structure, even in its dilapidated state, with original glass panes and a copper roof that had aged to a gorgeous green patina. I decided to do some research. I drove to the Pasadena City Hall and spent an afternoon in the records department, pulling permits and property records for my address. That's when I found something interesting. My property had been designated as a historic structure in 1994 under the Mills Act, a California state law that provided property tax reductions for historic buildings in exchange for their preservation. The designation paperwork was extensive. My house, along with the greenhouse, the original brick patio, and even the fruit trees were listed as protected historic features. Any alterations required approval from the Pasadena Heritage Commission, and the designation specifically noted that the property was exempt from certain local regulations that would compromise its historic character. I made copies of everything and called the Heritage Commission office. A helpful woman named Dorothy explained that historic preservation status did indeed supersede many HOA regulations, especially those that would require removing or significantly altering original features. The Mills Act is state law, Dorothy explained. Your HOA is a private organization. State law trumps HOA bylaws every time. If they're demanding you remove historic features, they're actually asking you to break the law. I felt a smile spreading across my face. So the greenhouse has to stay. Not only does it have to stay, but you're legally obligated to maintain it. Removing it would violate your Mills Act contract and could result in penalties from the city. Armed with this information, I waited for Brenda's next visit. It came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after I'd moved in. She arrived with another woman, younger, wearing yoga pants and carrying an expensive purse. This is Susan Martinez, the vice president of our HOA board, Brenda announced. We're here to discuss your continued violations and the greenhouse situation. Come in, I said, gesturing to my living room. I'd prepared a folder of documents and set them on the coffee table. Brenda launched into her speech before even sitting down. Mr. Thornton, you've accumulated $700 in fines over the past 3 weeks. The greenhouse is still standing. Your lawn was spotted at 3 1/8 inches last Thursday, and someone reported seeing your truck in the driveway at 9 p.m. last Saturday. I was loading equipment for an emergency call, I explained. A pipe burst at a client's house. Irrelevant. The rules are clear. She pulled out her tablet. We're prepared to place a lien on your property if these violations aren't corrected within 7 days. I picked up my folder and opened it calmly. Before we discuss liens, I think you should look at these documents. Brenda barely glanced at them. We're not interested in excuses. These aren't excuses. This is documentation showing that my property has historic preservation status under the California Mills Act. It's been designated since 1994. That got her attention. Susan leaned forward, her perfectly made-up face showing confusion. What does that mean? It means this house, including the greenhouse, the original features, and several other elements, are protected by state law. The Mills Act specifically states that historic properties are exempt from local regulations that would compromise their historic integrity. I pulled out the relevant statute and handed it to Brenda. That includes HOA regulations. Brenda's face flushed. That can't be right. HOA bylaws are legally binding contracts. They are, but they can't supersede state law. I called the Heritage Commission and spoke with an attorney. Would you like to see the email she sent me? I showed them my phone, where Dorothy had confirmed everything in writing and copied the city attorney's office. Susan was reading through the documents now, her expression shifting from confusion to concern. Brenda, this looks legitimate. It doesn't matter, Brenda snapped. He still has to follow the basic maintenance rules. The grass height, the parking restrictions, those aren't about historic preservation. Actually, I said, pulling out another document, the Mills Act designation requires that I maintain the property in a manner consistent with its historic period. That includes the landscape. According to the original plans from 1924, this property had a cottage-style garden with higher grass and native plants. The HOA's requirement for a golf course lawn actually violates the preservation requirements. This was stretching the truth a bit, but the principle was sound. The Heritage Commission had told me that natural, period-appropriate landscaping was encouraged. Brenda stood up abruptly. We'll need to consult with our attorney. That's fine, I said pleasantly. While you're at it, you might want to ask them about the fines you've already issued. I'm pretty sure demanding I remove protected historic features and fining me for refusing could be considered extortion under California Penal Code 518. I'd looked that up too. The statute was clear about using threats to compel someone to do something they weren't legally required to do. Susan grabbed Brenda's arm. We should go. They left quickly, and I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction, but I knew this wasn't over. People like Brenda didn't back down easily. I was right. 2 days later, I received a letter from the HOA's attorney, a firm called Harrison and Associates. The letter was 6 pages of legal jargon, but the message was clear. The HOA disputed my interpretation of the Mills Act and demanded I comply with all regulations or face legal action. I took the letter to a real estate attorney named Robert Chang, whose office was in Old Town, Pasadena. Robert was in his 60s, with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He read through everything carefully, including the HOA's letter, my Mills Act documentation, and the violation notices. This is interesting, he said finally. The HOA is on very shaky ground here. The Mills Act is explicit, and there's substantial case law supporting the supremacy of historic preservation statutes over HOA regulations. So I'm in the clear. Legally, yes. But HOAs can be vindictive. They might continue to harass you even if they know they can't win. He tapped the violation notices. These fines, for instance, they're not enforceable, but they'll keep sending them. Some HOAs will even file lawsuits they know they'll lose just to drain the homeowner's resources. What should I do? Robert thought for a moment. Let me send them a letter explaining the legal situation. I'll cite the relevant cases and make it clear that any continued action could be considered harassment. If they persist, we can file a complaint with the state or even pursue a civil harassment lawsuit. He drafted a letter that afternoon, and I approved it that evening. It was polite but firm, laying out exactly why the HOA's demands were unenforceable and warning them about the consequences of continued harassment. For 2 weeks, everything was quiet. I started working on the greenhouse, replacing broken glass panes and reinforcing the frame. I planted tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. My neighbor to the west, a retired teacher named Margaret, would sometimes come over to chat while I worked. She was thrilled that someone was finally fixing up the old place. Mrs. Henderson loved that greenhouse, Margaret told me one afternoon. She grew the most beautiful orchids, but the HOA kept sending her violation notices, and she was too old to fight them. It broke her heart. How long has the HOA been this bad? About 10 years, ever since Brenda took over. Before that, it was just a few neighbors getting together to organize block parties and keep the streets clean. But Brenda turned it into her personal fiefdom. She's driven out 3 families that I know of, just harassed them until they sold and moved. That's terrible, Margaret nodded. Most people just comply. It's easier than fighting. But I'm glad someone's finally standing up to her. The peace didn't last. On a Monday morning in early May, I found a citation on my door. This one wasn't about the greenhouse or my lawn. It was about the paint color on my house. Exterior paint color must be from the approved palette, the notice read. Your property is painted in an unapproved shade. You have 45 days to repaint the entire exterior in an approved color or face a fine of $200 per week. I stared at the notice in disbelief. My house was painted a soft sage green with cream trim, the exact colors it had been painted since at least the 1970s, based on the property photos I'd seen. It was a classic craftsman color scheme. I called Robert immediately. They're escalating. Paint color, he said after I read him the notice. Let me guess, they want you to paint it beige or gray. The approved palette is attached. It's all neutrals, nothing with any character. And your house is what color currently? Sage green with cream trim. It's been this color for decades. That's almost certainly a historically accurate color for a 1920s craftsman. The Heritage Commission will back you up on this. Don't do anything. I'll send another letter. But Brenda wasn't waiting for letters. That afternoon, she showed up at my door with a tall man in an expensive suit. He had slicked back hair and the kind of confident smirk that made me instantly dislike him. Mr. Thornton, Brenda said, this is Kevin Harrison from Harrison and Associates, our HOA attorney. He'd like to discuss your situation. Kevin extended his hand, which I shook reluctantly. Mr. Thornton, I think there's been some confusion about the Mills Act and its application to HOA regulations. Can we talk? I let them in, mainly because I wanted to hear what they had to say. Kevin sat down and pulled out his own folder of documents. The Mills Act is primarily concerned with structural preservation, he began. It doesn't give homeowners carte blanche to ignore all community standards. The HOA has a legitimate interest in maintaining property values and aesthetic consistency. The Mills Act specifically mentions maintaining historic character, I countered. That includes appropriate colors, materials, and landscaping. but your HOA existed before you purchased the property. When you bought the house, you entered into a contract agreeing to abide by HOA rules. That's legally binding. Not when those rules conflict with state law. Kevin's smile tightened. I've reviewed the case law. The Mills Act has never been used to completely override HOA authority in California. At most, courts have required HOAs to make reasonable accommodations. What's unreasonable about letting me keep a greenhouse that's been here for 100 years? The greenhouse is one issue. But the paint color, the lawn height, the parking violations, those have nothing to do with historic preservation. Those are basic community standards. I felt my temper rising. So you want me to paint a 1920s craftsman bungalow beige, cut a cottage garden down to look like a pudding green? That's the opposite of preservation. Brenda jumped in. We're prepared to make some compromises. You can keep the greenhouse, but it must be screened from street view with approved fencing. You can paint your house any color from the approved palette, and you must follow all parking and maintenance regulations like every other resident. Those aren't compromises. You're still trying to force me to alter a historic property. Kevin leaned forward. Mr. Thornton, let me be frank. The HOA can make your life very difficult. We can continue to fine you, place liens on your property, and tie you up in court for years. Even if you eventually win, the cost and stress might not be worth it. Wouldn't it be easier to just follow the rules? I stood up. I think we're done here. Think about it, Kevin said, handing me his card. We'll give you until the end of the month to decide. After they left, I called Robert again. They just tried to intimidate me. The HOA attorney basically threatened to harass me into compliance. Did he say that explicitly? I recounted the conversation as accurately as I could. Robert was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's helpful, actually. It shows intent. If they continue, we have grounds for a harassment claim. For now, sit tight. I'm preparing a more detailed response that will cite specific case law, and I think it's time to involve the Heritage Commission officially." Over the next week, Robert worked with Dorothy at the Heritage Commission to prepare a formal opinion on my property's status. The opinion, signed by the city attorney, was unambiguous. My property's historic preservation designation superseded HOA regulations that would compromise its historic integrity. This included the greenhouse, the color scheme, and the cottage-style landscaping. The Heritage Commission went even further, noting that the HOA's demands could put me in violation of my Mills Act contract, which could result in the loss of property tax benefits and potential fines from the city. They sent a copy of the opinion to the HOA board and their attorney. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. On the 1st of June, I received notice that the HOA was scheduling a hearing to determine whether my property should be forcibly brought into compliance. If the board voted in favor, they would assess a special assessment of $15,000 to hire contractors to do the work, which would be added to my property as a lien. Can they do that? I asked Robert when I showed him the notice. They can hold the hearing, but they can't enforce it. The Heritage Commission's opinion is legally binding. If they try to do work on your property without your consent, that's trespassing and vandalism. They'd be breaking the law. So what do I do? Attend the hearing. Bring all your documentation. Make your case to the other homeowners. The board might be stubborn, but if enough residents understand the situation, they might vote against this action. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday evening at the community center, a small building at the entrance to the neighborhood. I spent the weekend preparing, making copies of all my documents and rehearsing what I'd say. When I arrived, the room was packed. I recognized Margaret and a few other neighbors, but most of the faces were unfamiliar. Brenda sat at a table at the front of the room with Susan and 3 other board members. A man in his 50s named Donald Wright, a woman in her 30s named Patricia Kane, and an elderly man named Raymond Foster. Brenda called the meeting to order and immediately launched into her presentation. She had a PowerPoint showing photos of my property, with circles and arrows highlighting every alleged violation. The greenhouse looked ominous in her photos, which were taken from unflattering angles. My lawn looked like a jungle, though in reality it was just slightly longer than the HOA preferred. "This property has become a blight on our community," Brenda declared. "Mr. Thornton has refused to comply with basic standards, despite numerous notices and good faith attempts to reach a compromise. The board recommends authorizing the special assessment to bring the property into compliance." "That's not what happened," I said loudly. Brenda glared at me. "You'll have a chance to speak, Mr. Thornton. Please wait your turn." She continued for another 10 minutes, painting me as a difficult, unreasonable homeowner who thought the rules didn't apply to him. When she finally finished, she asked if anyone wanted to speak. I stood up immediately. "I'd like to address the board and the community." Brenda nodded reluctantly. I walked to the front of the room and set up my own laptop, connecting it to the projector. I'd prepared a presentation too. "My name is Yannick Thornton, and I bought the property at 2847 Magnolia Street 2 months ago. What Mrs. Patterson didn't mention is that my property has been designated as a historic structure under the California Mills Act since 1994. I pulled up the designation documents on the screen. This designation is governed by state law which supersedes HOA regulations. I walked them through everything: the Mills Act requirements, the Heritage Commission's opinion, the legal precedent. I showed photos of my greenhouse, explaining its historic significance. I displayed the original color palette from 1924, which matched my current paint scheme. "The HOA isn't asking me to follow reasonable rules," I concluded. "They're asking me to break state law by destroying historic features and altering a protected property." I've provided all of this information to the board, along with legal opinions from both my attorney and the city attorney's office. But instead of acknowledging the law, they're trying to intimidate me into compliance. The room was silent. Then Margaret stood up. "I'd like to say something." Brenda looked annoyed. "This isn't an open forum." "Actually," Raymond Foster said quietly, "according to our bylaws, any homeowner can speak at a hearing. Let her talk, Brenda." Margaret walked to the front. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 38 years. I remember when that house was first restored in the 70s, and when Mrs. Henderson got the historic designation in the 90s. She was so proud of it. The greenhouse was featured in a home and garden magazine. It's part of our neighborhood's character." She turned to look at Brenda. "But for the past 10 years, this HOA has been more interested in forcing conformity than celebrating what makes our community special. I think it's time we remember why we chose to live in a historic neighborhood in the first place." Several people applauded. Another homeowner stood up, a younger man I didn't recognize. "I'd like to hear from the HOA attorney. Is what Mr. Thornton saying accurate? Does his historic designation really override our rules?" Kevin Harrison stood up from the back of the room. I hadn't seen him come in. "It's more complicated than that. While the Mills Act does provide certain protections, the scope of those protections is a matter of legal interpretation. The HOA believes our regulations are reasonable and don't significantly impact the property's historic character." "That's not what the city attorney said," I interjected. I pulled up the Heritage Commission's opinion and read the relevant section aloud. "HOA regulations requiring the removal or significant alteration of designated historic features are unenforceable under California state law." Any attempt to compel such alterations through fines, liens, or other means may constitute illegal harassment. The room erupted in conversation. Donald Wright, one of the board members, raised his hand. "Brenda, did you know about this opinion from the city attorney?" Brenda's face was red. "We received it, but our attorney advised us that it wasn't binding." "The city attorney's interpretation of state law isn't binding." Donald sounded incredulous. "That doesn't make sense." Kevin tried to regain control. "What I meant is that the Heritage Commission's opinion is advisory. Ultimately, if there's a dispute, it would need to be resolved in court." "So you want the HOA to sue Mr. Thornton, even though the city attorney says we'd be wrong?" This came from Patricia Kane. "How much would that cost?" Kevin hesitated. "Legal fees could range from $50,000 to $100,000, depending on how long the case takes." The room exploded. Residents started shouting questions. How could the HOA spend that much money? Why were they targeting this property? What about the other violations in the neighborhood? That last question came from a man I recognized as my neighbor across the street. He stood up and pointed at Susan Martinez. "Susan, your son parks his sports car on your front lawn half the time. I've never seen him get a violation notice. And Donald, your backyard shed is definitely bigger than the regulations allow. Why is Mr. Thornton being singled out?" Brenda tried to restore order by banging a gavel, but the meeting had devolved into chaos. Residents were angry, not at me, but at the board. I saw several people taking photos of my presentation slides with their phones. Finally, Raymond Foster stood up. He was the oldest board member, and something about his quiet authority made people settle down. "I've been on this board for 15 years, he said slowly. "I remember when we formed the HOA. It was supposed to be about maintaining our community, not about power trips or personal vendettas." He looked directly at Brenda. "I move that we dismiss this action against Mr. Thornton and formally acknowledge his property's historic status. Furthermore, I move that we revise our bylaws to exempt historic properties from regulations that conflict with preservation requirements." "Second," Patricia Kane said immediately. Brenda looked panicked. "We need to discuss this in executive session first." "No, we don't," Raymond said firmly. "This is a board decision, and we're making it now." "All in favor?" Raymond and Patricia raised their hands. Donald Wright hesitated, then raised his hand as well. 3 out of 5 board members. "Motion passes," Raymond declared. "This hearing is adjourned." Brenda stood up so fast she knocked over her chair. "This isn't over. The board will appeal." "You can't appeal a board vote, Brenda," Raymond said wearily. "You know that." I gathered my materials and was immediately surrounded by neighbors congratulating me and asking questions about the Mills Act. Margaret hugged me. "You did it." But I noticed Brenda and Susan leaving quickly with Kevin Harrison, their heads bent together in intense conversation. I had a sinking feeling that Raymond was wrong. This wasn't over. I was proven right 2 days later when I received another letter from Harrison and Associates. This one informed me that despite the board's vote, the HOA was placing a lien on my property for the accumulated fines totaling $950. The letter claimed that the fines were for legitimate violations unrelated to the historic preservation issues and were therefore enforceable. I immediately sent the letter to Robert. He called me that evening, sounding angry. "This is harassment, plain and simple. The board voted to dismiss the action against you. The HOA president can't just ignore that vote and continue on her own authority. Can she place a lien?" Technically, the HOA has the power to place liens for unpaid fines, but these fines were issued based on regulations that don't apply to you. I'm going to file a complaint with the state and send a cease and desist letter. If Brenda continues, we can pursue a civil harassment lawsuit. How much would that cost? Probably 20 to 30,000, depending on how long it takes. But if we win, the HOA would have to pay your legal fees. And frankly, based on everything you've told me, I think we'd win. I thought about it. I'd already spent $3,000 on legal fees. Did I really want to spend more? But then I thought about Mrs. Henderson, driven to heartbreak by this same HOA. I thought about the other families Margaret had mentioned, harassed until they gave up and left. Someone had to stand up to Brenda. Let's do it, I said. Robert filed the harassment complaint the next day. The complaint detailed every violation notice, every fine, every threatening letter. It included the Heritage Commission's opinion, the board's vote to dismiss the action against me, and Brenda's decision to continue anyway. The complaint argued that Brenda was acting beyond her authority and engaging in a pattern of harassment designed to force me to sell my property or comply with unlawful demands. We also filed a motion to block the lien until the harassment claim could be resolved. A judge granted a temporary restraining order, preventing the HOA from taking any action against my property until a hearing could be held. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. During that time, I continued working on my house and tried to ignore the dirty looks Brenda gave me whenever our paths crossed. But I noticed something interesting. Several neighbors started coming by to ask about the Mills Act. It turned out that at least 5 other properties in the neighborhood had historic designations that the owners had never known about. One of those owners was a woman named Allison Chen who lived 3 streets over. Her house was a beautiful Spanish colonial revival from 1928, and she'd been fighting the HOA for years over her red tile roof, which they wanted her to replace with a more neutral gray. When she discovered her house was designated under the Mills Act, she nearly cried with relief. "They've been fining me for 5 years," she told me. "I've paid over $8,000 rather than replace that roof. It's original tile from Mexico." "You should talk to my attorney," I said, giving her Robert's card. "Those fines probably aren't enforceable." By the time the hearing arrived, Robert had been contacted by 4 other homeowners with similar stories. We met at his office the morning of the hearing to coordinate our strategy. "This is bigger than just your case now," Robert explained. "If we can prove that the HOA has been systematically targeting historic properties and collecting illegal fines, we might be able to pursue a class action lawsuit. Would that get everyone's money back? Potentially. At minimum, it would force the HOA to refund the fines and pay damages for the harassment. But let's focus on today's hearing first." The hearing was held in Pasadena Superior Court. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wood paneling and fluorescent lights that hummed. Judge Maria Alvarez was in her 50s, with dark hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything. Kevin Harrison represented the HOA, and he came prepared with his own stack of documents. But Robert had a secret weapon, Raymond Foster. The former board member had agreed to testify about the HOA's practices and Brenda's behavior. When Robert called him to the stand, Raymond explained how the board had voted to dismiss the action against me, and how Brenda had ignored that vote. "In my 15 years on the board, I've never seen a president act so unilaterally," Raymond testified. "The HOA is supposed to be governed by the board as a whole, not one person's personal agenda." Kevin tried to argue that Brenda had the authority to enforce existing fines regardless of the board's vote, but Judge Alvarez wasn't buying it. "Mr. Harrison," she said, "you're telling me that the HOA board voted to acknowledge this property's historic status and dismiss the violations, but your client continued to pursue fines for those same violations." The fines were for violations that occurred before the board's vote, Your Honor. But the violations were based on regulations that don't apply to historic properties under state law. The Heritage Commission made that clear weeks before the board vote. She looked at her notes. It seems to me that your client is trying to penalize Mr. Thornton for asserting his legal rights. That's textbook harassment. Kevin tried several more arguments, but the judge shut down each one. Finally, she made her ruling. I'm granting Mr. Thornton's motion to block the lien and dismiss all fines related to his property's historic features. Furthermore, I'm ordering the HOA to formally adopt policies acknowledging historic preservation laws and exempting designated properties from conflicting regulations. The HOA will pay Mr. Thornton's legal fees, which I'm setting at $5,000 pending a detailed accounting. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was really over, but Judge Alvarez wasn't done. I'm also concerned about the allegations of systematic targeting of historic properties. Mr. Harrison, I strongly suggest your client review all fines and violations issued over the past 10 years to ensure they were properly applied. If I see any more cases like this in my courtroom, I may order a full audit of the HOA's finances and practices. Kevin's face was pale as we left the courtroom. In the hallway, Robert shook my hand. Congratulations, you won. We won, I corrected. I couldn't have done this without you. The fight isn't over for everyone, though, Robert said, nodding toward Allison Chen and the other homeowners who'd attended the hearing. Are you willing to be part of a class action? I didn't hesitate. Absolutely. Over the next 2 months, Robert built a case against the Magnolia Gardens HOA on behalf of 9 homeowners with historic properties. The evidence was damning. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines collected for violations that were legally unenforceable. Detailed records showed that Brenda had specifically targeted historic homes, issuing violations at rates 5 times higher than for non-historic properties. But as Robert dug deeper, he found something worse. The HOA's financial records showed significant discrepancies. Money from fines was supposed to go into a community improvement fund, but large amounts had been transferred to accounts controlled by Brenda personally. She'd allegedly spent HOA funds on personal expenses, including a luxury car lease and vacations, disguising them as business expenses. This isn't just harassment, Robert told me grimly. This is embezzlement. We need to bring in law enforcement. He filed a report with the Pasadena Police Department, providing copies of all the financial records. 2 weeks later, I watched from my front window as police officers arrived at Brenda's house, 3 doors down from mine. They were there for 2 hours, eventually leaving with boxes of documents and Brenda's laptop. The neighborhood was buzzing with gossip. Margaret called me that evening to fill me in on what she'd heard. Susan Martinez is cooperating with the police, she said. Apparently, she's been worried about Brenda's behavior for months but was too afraid to speak up. She's turning over emails and text messages that show Brenda knew the historic property fines were illegal but pursued them anyway to collect money. That's good for the investigation, I guess. There's more. The police are looking into whether Brenda forged signatures on some of the fine approval documents. Several board members are saying they never approved the fines Brenda issued. The legal process moved slowly after that. The class action lawsuit was put on hold while the criminal investigation proceeded. Brenda was arrested in September and charged with embezzlement, fraud, and extortion. The total amount she'd allegedly stolen from the HOA was over $200,000 spanning 7 years. The trial took place the following spring. I attended several days of testimony, watching as prosecutors laid out the evidence. Susan Martinez testified about how Brenda had pressured her and other board members to rubber stamp her decisions. Raymond Foster explained how Brenda had gradually consolidated power, pushing out anyone who questioned her. Allison Chen and I both testified about the harassment we'd experienced. The most damaging evidence came from Brenda's own records. She'd kept detailed spreadsheets tracking fines by property, with notes like "push harder on this one" and "won't fight back" next to specific addresses. Historic properties were highlighted in yellow, and notes indicated she saw them as revenue opportunities. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Brenda was found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 4 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA and affected homeowners. With Brenda gone, the HOA underwent a complete transformation. New board elections were held, and a slate of reform candidates, including Raymond Foster and Allison Chen, won easily. One of their first acts was to settle the class action lawsuit, agreeing to refund all improper fines and pay damages. I received a check for $14,000, covering my legal fees and compensation for the harassment. The new board also adopted comprehensive reforms. They reduced the rulebook from 80 pages to 15, focusing on genuine community issues like fire safety and shared space maintenance. They created explicit exemptions for historic properties and set up a review process to prevent future abuses. Most importantly, they established financial oversight with regular audits and multiple signature requirements for any significant expenses. On a warm Saturday in June, more than a year after I'd first moved in, I hosted a neighborhood barbecue in my backyard. The greenhouse was fully restored and filled with thriving vegetables and flowers. The brick patio had been repaired, and the fruit trees were heavy with ripening peaches and plums. My house glowed in the afternoon sun, its sage green paint and cream trim lovingly restored to match the original 1924 color scheme. Margaret arrived first, bringing homemade pie. Allison came with her husband and kids. Raymond Foster showed up with his wife and a case of beer. Even Susan Martinez came, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen her. "I want to apologize," Susan said quietly, pulling me aside. "I should have stood up to Brenda years ago. I was afraid of confrontation, and I let her hurt a lot of people." "You made it right in the end," I said. "Your testimony was crucial. Still, I'm sorry you had to go through all that." "It was worth it," I said, looking around at my restored property. "I got my dream home, and we got a better community out of it." As the evening wore on, and the sun set behind the San Gabriel Mountains, I stood in my greenhouse watering tomato plants and reflected on the past year. I'd come to Pasadena looking for a peaceful retirement project, and I'd ended up in a legal battle that changed an entire neighborhood. But I'd also learned something important. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult and expensive and scary. The historic designation that saved my property hadn't just protected an old house and greenhouse. It had exposed corruption, brought a community together, and helped a dozen families escape from under the thumb of a tyrant. Mrs. Henderson would have been proud. I heard laughter from the patio and went to join my neighbors. These were good people, and this was a good place to build a life. The fight had been hard, but as I looked around at the community we'd created together, I knew it had been worth every moment. My phone buzzed with a text from Robert. The last of the restitution checks had been sent out, officially closing the class action case. The HOA's insurance company had paid out over $500,000 to affected homeowners, and several other HOAs in California had already begun reviewing their policies on historic properties to avoid similar lawsuits. I smiled and pocketed my phone. It was time to stop thinking about legal battles and start enjoying the home I'd fought so hard to protect. I grabbed a beer from the cooler and joined the conversation on the patio, where Raymond was telling stories about Pasadena in the 60s. Later that night, after everyone had left and I was cleaning up, I walked through my house room by room. The hardwood floors gleamed. The craftsman details I'd carefully restored caught the light from my lamps. Through the window, I could see the greenhouse standing proud in the moonlight, just as it had for nearly a century. This was exactly what I'd wanted when I bought the place. A piece of history to preserve and enjoy, a project to pour my skills into, and a community to be part of. I'd gotten all of that, plus a story that would probably follow me for the rest of my life. The next morning, I woke early and made coffee before heading out to the greenhouse. I'd been experimenting with heirloom tomato varieties, trying to grow some of the same cultivars that would have been popular in the 1920s. It was a small thing, but it felt right to honor the property's history in whatever ways I could. As I worked, I thought about the future. The neighborhood had stabilized. Property values were actually increasing now that the oppressive HOA regime was gone, and several younger families were moving in, attracted by the historic character and sense of community. The new board was even planning a neighborhood historic home tour to celebrate the area's architectural heritage. My phone rang. It was a producer from a local news station. They'd heard about the case and wanted to do a story about historic preservation and HOA reform. I agreed to an interview, figuring that the more publicity this got, the better. Maybe it would help other homeowners who were facing similar situations. The interview aired 2 weeks later. It was a well-done piece that explained the Mills Act, showed off my restored greenhouse, and interviewed several other homeowners who'd benefited from the case. At the end, they mentioned that California legislators were considering a bill to clarify the relationship between HOAs and historic preservation laws, partly in response to our situation. That interview led to more attention. I got calls from homeowners in other states dealing with similar HOA conflicts. A preservation advocacy group asked if I'd be willing to speak at their annual conference, and a publisher reached out about potentially turning my experience into a book about HOA reform. I took it all in stride. I wasn't trying to become a crusader or public figure. I just wanted to fix up my house and enjoy my retirement. But if my experience could help others, I was happy to share it. By the fall, my property had become something of a local landmark. The Heritage Commission asked if I'd be willing to put up a historic marker, and I agreed. The marker was installed in October, a small bronze plaque near my front walkway that read, Mills House, 1924. Craftsman bungalow with original greenhouse. Designated historic property, 1994. Preserved under California Mills Act. I stood looking at that marker on the day it was installed, feeling a sense of completion. This was my home, officially and permanently protected. No HOA, no matter how aggressive, could take that away. The final chapter of the saga came in December when I received a letter from Brenda. She was in prison, and the letter was brief. Mr. Thornton, it read, I want you to know that I don't blame you for what happened. I was wrong about the historic designation, and I was wrong about a lot of other things too. I let power go to my head, and I hurt people who were just trying to live their lives. I'm sorry for what I put you through. I hope you enjoy your home. It really is beautiful. Sincerely, Brenda Patterson. I read the letter twice, then filed it away. I appreciated the apology, though it didn't change what had happened. But I recognized the courage it took to write it, and I hoped Brenda would find a better path when she eventually got out of prison. As the year came to a close, I reflected on everything that had happened since I'd bought the house 18 months earlier. I'd faced down a corrupt HOA president, learned more about historic preservation law than I'd ever expected to know, helped reform an entire community organization, and contributed to legislative change that might help homeowners across the state. But most importantly, I'd created the retirement home I'd always dreamed of. Every morning, I woke up in a beautiful historic house surrounded by a garden I'd nurtured. I had good neighbors who'd become friends. I had projects to work on, from maintaining the greenhouse to planning next year's vegetable garden. And I had the satisfaction of knowing that I'd stood up for what was right. On Christmas Eve, I hosted another gathering. This one was smaller, just Margaret, Allison and her family, Raymond and his wife, and a few other close neighbors. We gathered in my living room, which I decorated with vintage ornaments that matched the house's era. The fireplace crackled and white lights twinkled on a real tree I'd set up in the corner. "I want to make a toast," Margaret said, raising her glass of wine. "To Yannick, who had the courage to fight when the rest of us had given up, and to this house, may it stand for another 100 years." We clinked glasses, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. This was home. This was community. This was exactly where I was supposed to be. Later, after everyone had left and I was alone with my thoughts, I walked out to the greenhouse one last time. The December night was cool, but inside the greenhouse, it was warm and humid. My winter crops were thriving: lettuce, kale, and herbs that would keep me supplied through the cold months. I thought about Mrs. Henderson, the previous owner who'd loved this place so much. I thought about all the people who'd lived here over the past century, each adding their own chapter to the house's story. And I thought about my own chapter, dramatic and unexpected as it had been. The historic designation had saved my property, but it had also taught me something valuable about standing up for principle, even when it's difficult. The Mills Act was more than just a law about old buildings. It was a statement that some things are worth preserving, worth fighting for, worth protecting against short-sighted demands for conformity. As I locked up the greenhouse and headed back to my house, I made a silent promise to Mrs. Henderson and all the previous caretakers of this property. I would maintain it with love and respect, honor its history while making it my own, and pass it on someday to someone who would appreciate it as much as I did. The lights from my living room window cast a warm glow across the front yard. My sage green house with its cream trim looked like something from a storybook, a piece of the past preserved in the present. And inside, waiting for me, was the future I'd built through stubbornness, legal knowledge, and a refusal to back down from what I knew was right. I climbed the steps to my front porch, running my hand along the original craftsman railing, and went inside. Home at last, in every sense of the word.